The map of Africa in the 1880s was a canvas of mystery and desire, its vast interior still rendered in the pale, speculative colors of European cartographers. Yet this terra incognita was rapidly becoming a theater of imperial frenzy. A fever had gripped the continent's northern shores, a predatory energy radiating from the capitals of Europe. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal, each driven by a potent cocktail of ambition and anxiety, turned their gazes southward. The motives were as varied as they were compelling: the lure of untapped mineral wealth from gold to diamonds, the strategic control of vital trade routes like the Nile and the Niger, and perhaps most intoxicating, the raw currency of national prestige. In an age of burgeoning nationalism, colonies were not merely assets but symbols, tangible proof of a nation's place in the global hierarchy. This was no leisurely exploration. It was a scramble, a term that perfectly captured the undignified, aggressive rush. For territory, agents of empire, a mix of soldiers, traders, and missionaries, pushed inland from coastal enclaves, planting flags and signing treaties with local leaders who often had little understanding of the permanent sovereignty they were ceding. The lines of claimed territory began to sprawl across maps in competing shades of pink, blue, and green, their edges blurring and colliding. Tensions simmered and then boiled over in remote river valleys and sun-baked plains. A German trader's outpost would appear uncomfortably close to a British consulate. A French military column would find its path blocked by a Portuguese garrison. Each incident, relayed by telegraph to distant foreign ministries, was a spark threatening a larger conflagration. The threat was no longer abstract. The competitive annexations, conducted with a dizzying lack of coordination, created a tangle of overlapping claims and diplomatic insults. The possibility of a clash, a skirmish in the Sahara escalating into naval confrontation in the Mediterranean, a dispute over a West African lagoon spiraling into a European war, became a chillingly real prospect for statesmen in London, Paris, and Berlin. The very system of balance of power politics that had maintained an uneasy peace in Europe was being dangerously destabilized by the chaotic land grab in Africa. The continent was being carved up with a cleaver, not a scalpel, and the sound of splintering wood echoed in diplomatic chambers. It was clear that this unsustainable race, driven by greed and rivalry, required a formal, civilized solution, a grand negotiation to impose order on the chaos, to partition the prize without the partitioners coming to blows. The stage was set not for a retreat, but for a conference. The summons went out from the Wilhelmstrasse, an invitation couched in the language of peace and pragmatism. German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the venerable architect of European equilibrium, had determined that the African question required a continental solution. In the winter of 1884, the great powers assembled not on a battlefield, but in the gilded halls of the German Chancellery in Berlin. The scene was one of calculated civility, a stark contrast to the raw scramble it sought to regulate. Plenipotentiaries from 14 European nations, along with the United States, gathered around polished mahogany tables, their uniforms and formal attire a tapestry of imperial authority. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the low murmur of diplomatic French, the lingua franca of statecraft. Central to the chamber were the maps, vast sheets of paper unfurled across the tables, depicting Africa not as a mosaic of kingdoms and cultures, but as an empty space, a blank slate awaiting the imprint of European will. Coastlines were meticulously detailed, but the interiors faded into speculative topography, marked only by the occasional river or mountain range whose true course was often guessed. The men leaned over these cartographies, fingers tracing potential borders, their gestures casual yet freighted with the fate of millions. The most profound silence in the room, however, was the one that went unremarked upon, the absolute absence of any African voice. No envoy from the Ashanti Kingdom, no representative of the Sokoto Caliphate, no elder from the Zulu nation was present to witness or contest the dissection of their homelands. The continent was an object to be apportioned, not a subject with agency. Bismarck, presiding with his formidable, deliberate presence, steered the initial discussions toward establishing the rules of this new imperial game. The core principle that emerged from the early sessions was that of effective occupation. Mere claims based on ancient treaties or the planting of a flag on a deserted beach would no longer suffice. To secure international recognition of a territorial claim, a power must demonstrate tangible administrative control. This meant establishing governmental presence, maintaining order, and having the capacity to enforce treaties and protect existing rights, primarily those of other European traders. It was a doctrine designed to lend a veneer of legality to conquest and to prevent conflicts between the powers themselves by creating a clear, if arbitrary, benchmark for ownership. The principle was less about justice and more about managing competition, ensuring the scramble proceeded with a semblance of order, turning chaotic land grabs into a bureaucratically sanctioned partition. With the principle of effective occupation established, the conference turned to its most consequential task, the drawing of lines. Rulers and compasses became the instruments of destiny. The delegates, with a cartographer's detachment, began to partition the map, their straight lines slicing across rivers, watersheds, and savannas with geometric indifference. These borders were exercises in European logic, designed for administrative convenience and strategic balance among the powers, deliberately blind to the human landscape they transected. Ancient kingdoms were bifurcated. Ethnic groups who had shared language and lineage for centuries found themselves suddenly assigned to rival empires. The dense tapestry of tribal territories, linguistic zones, and historical frontiers was ignored, rendered invisible beneath the stark, ink-stained grids imposed from Berlin. The first major allocation set a tone of breathtaking audacity. King Leopold II of Belgium, a monarch whose ambitions far outstripped his nation's size, secured recognition for his personal fiefdom, the Congo Free State. Under the guise of philanthropic association and the promise of suppressing the Arab slave trade, Leopold persuaded the Assembly to grant him sole sovereignty over a vast Central African territory nearly 80 times the size of Belgium itself. It was a masterstroke of cynical diplomacy, framed as a neutral, humanitarian project rather than a colonial acquisition. The other powers, keen to prevent the resource-rich basin from falling to a major rival, acquiesced. Maps were swiftly annotated, the great curve of the Congo River and its tributaries enclosed within a new arbitrary border that belonged not to a nation, but to one man. No thought was given to the millions of people within that new outline, whose lives were now subject to a distant king's unchecked whim. Other lines swiftly followed. Germany solidified its claims in East and Southwest Africa, creating angular territories. France saw its sphere in West Africa formally acknowledged, its borders extended with little regard for the existing Sokoto Caliphate or the Mende empires. Portugal's claims to Angola and Mozambique were reinforced, their hinterlands carved into oblong shapes. Britain secured key strategic interests, particularly regarding the Niger Delta and access to the interior. Each stroke of the pen was a transaction, a balancing of European interests achieved. Through backroom bargains and trade-offs, the delegates debated navigational rights on major rivers and standards for commercial treaties, their discussions dry and procedural, even as they authored human catastrophes. The room was filled with the sound of scratching pens and the rustle of map paper, a quiet symphony of division that would echo for generations, creating a continent of straight lines and crooked legacies. The Berlin Conference adjourned in February 1885, its final act not a treaty but a blueprint for conquest. The immediate outcomes were a swift realignment of imperial fortunes, guided by the newly inked lines. Britain secured its vital strategic interests, control of the Niger Delta's trade, a protectorate over Bechuanaland to block German expansion, and a free hand in Egypt, safeguarding the route to India. France received formal recognition of its vast West African sphere, a sprawling domain stretching from the Senegal River to Lake Chad, its borders drawn to facilitate administrative consolidation rather than reflect any local reality. The principle of effective occupation, intended to prevent conflict, instead acted as a starting pistol. The scramble for Africa, once chaotic, was now a sanctioned race, accelerating into a frenzied dash as powers rushed to physically occupy the territories they had claimed on paper. The long-term consequences of those Berlin lines unfolded over decades, a slow-motion catastrophe of political geometry. The artificial borders, conceived in a European chamber, hardened into the immutable boundaries of modern African states. They imprisoned rival ethnic groups within the same colonial administration and severed kin groups across frontiers, creating perpetual minorities and sowing the seeds of entrenched conflict. The colonial economies established were designed for extraction, not development. Vast plantations for cash crops, mines for diamonds and copper, all feeding industrial Europe while leaving behind infrastructure geared solely for export. Political institutions were imposed to facilitate control, not self-governance, breeding a legacy of authoritarianism and instability. The conference's ultimate legacy was one of profound imposition. It was a European solution to a European problem, a diplomatic maneuver to manage imperial rivalry that casually redrew a continent without the consent, consultation, or even comprehension of its inhabitants. Africa was reshaped by distant hands-wielding rulers, its rich human tapestry torn and patched with the coarse thread of colonial ambition. The silence of Berlin, where a continent's fate was decided in its absence, became the defining echo of the modern era, a foundational injustice from which the long, arduous struggles for identity, unity, and true sovereignty would painfully begin. The map was remade, but the cost would be borne for generations.